You're walking through a forest at dusk, and the light is fading fast. The trees seem closer than they were a moment ago, their branches reaching overhead like interlaced fingers. Then you hear it, a sound that doesn't quite fit. Not an owl, not a deer, not anything you can immediately name. Your rational mind begins cataloging possibilities, while something more primal whispers that you should probably head back to the trail. In that moment, you're connected to thousands of years of human experience, to every person who ever wondered what was watching them from just beyond the firelight. Welcome back to Midnight Deep Dive. If you're new here, welcome to our cozy corner of the internet where we explore history's most intriguing mysteries, designed to ease you gently into sleep. Wherever you are right now, I'm so glad you've decided to join me for this journey. Tonight, we're venturing into the realm of cryptozoology, the study of hidden animals, to meet 10 of the world's most famous creatures that may or may not exist. From North American forests to Mongolian deserts, from Scottish lochs to Australian swamps, we'll trace the stories of beings that live in that fascinating space between myth and reality. So settle into your most comfortable position, let your breathing slow, and join me as we travel across continents and centuries, exploring 10 cryptids that have haunted the human imagination. Our journey begins in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, where something large has been leaving footprints for thousands of years. There's something about forests that invites mystery. The way light filters through the canopy, creating patches of brightness and shadow. The sounds that could be wind through branches or could be something moving parallel to your path. The sense that you're being observed by eyes you can't see. For centuries, people in the Pacific Northwest have reported encounters with something that shouldn't exist according to our current understanding of North American wildlife, yet persists in both indigenous tradition and modern sightings. Bigfoot, or as many indigenous peoples called it, Sasquatch. The name Sasquatch comes from the Halkomlan word Saskits, used by the Coast Salish peoples of British Columbia. But nearly every indigenous nation in the Pacific Northwest has its own name and traditions surrounding these beings. The Lummi called them Tisamequis. The Spokane knew them as Siatik. To the Chinook, they were the Skookum. These weren't mythological creatures in the way we might think of dragons or unicorns. They were understood as a type of wild people, a species that lived in the deep forests and preferred to avoid human contact. The traditions surrounding these beings vary significantly among different indigenous nations. Some described them as supernatural or spirit beings, guardians of the forest who could punish those who disrespected nature. Others spoke of them more matter-of-factly as a tribe of hairy giants who lived in the mountains, occasionally stealing salmon from drying racks or frightening hunters. Some traditions warned against seeking them out, while others simply acknowledged their existence as part of the natural order. What's consistent across many traditions is the description. Very tall, covered in hair, walking upright, possessing great strength, and generally avoiding human contact. European settlers began encountering these stories when they arrived in the Pacific Northwest, and some had their own experiences that seemed to confirm the indigenous accounts. In 1840, a missionary named Elkanah Walker wrote about local indigenous people's fear of a race of giants living in the mountains. Throughout the 19th century, occasional newspaper reports described encounters with wild men or strange ape-like creatures in remote areas, though these stories were often sensationalized or mixed with tall tales. The modern Bigfoot phenomenon really began in 1958 in Del Norte County, California. A bulldozer operator named Jerry Crew found enormous footprints around his equipment at a logging site. The prints were approximately 16 inches long and appeared to show a large, humanoid foot. Crew made plaster casts of the prints and brought them to the local newspaper. The story was picked up nationally, and the Humboldt Times coined the name Bigfoot in its coverage. The prints and the story sparked a wave of interest in these mysterious creatures. What many people don't know is that the 1958 prints were likely a hoax. Decades later, after the death of a logger named Ray Wallace who worked at the same site, his family revealed that Wallace had created fake wooden feet and made the prints as a prank. However, this doesn't explain the hundreds of other reports that came before 1958, or the thousands that have emerged since from people who had no connection to Wallace and no apparent reason to fabricate their stories. The most famous piece of Bigfoot evidence remains the Patterson-Gimlin film, shot on October 20, 1967, in Bluff Creek, California. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin were on horseback, specifically looking for Bigfoot when they rounded a bend, and allegedly encountered a large, hairy, bipedal creature by the creek. Patterson's horse reared in fright, and Patterson grabbed his camera and filmed approximately 60 seconds of footage showing the creature walking away and briefly looking back at the camera before disappearing into the forest. The creature in the film appears to be a large female, estimated at over 6 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with a distinctive walking gait and visible muscle movement beneath the hair. The footage has been analyzed extensively by both believers and skeptics. Some experts in primate locomotion have stated that the walking pattern would be extremely difficult for a human to fake, particularly given the technology available in 1967. Others have pointed out details that suggest it could be a person in a well-made costume. The film remains controversial over 50 years later. No one has definitively proven it's a hoax, despite numerous attempts. Bob Gimlin, who is still alive, has maintained his entire life that what they filmed was a real creature. Roger Patterson, who died in 1972, never wavered from his story. Yet skeptics point out that Patterson had financial motivations, having previously tried to make a Bigfoot documentary, and that he conveniently happened to be carrying a movie camera when he had his once-in-a-lifetime encounter. What makes Bigfoot particularly interesting from a cryptozoological perspective is the sheer number of reported sightings. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization database contains thousands of reports from across North America, with concentrations in the Pacific Northwest, the Appalachian Mountains, and parts of Canada. These reports come from hikers, hunters, Forest Service employees, law enforcement officers, and ordinary people who claim to have seen something that doesn't match any known animal. The descriptions are remarkably consistent. A bipedal creature standing between 7 and 10 feet tall, covered in dark brown, reddish, or black hair, with a pronounced brow ridge, no visible neck, broad shoulders, and long arms. Witnesses often describe a powerful, unpleasant odor. Many report feeling an overwhelming sense of fear, sometimes described as primal or instinctive rather than conscious. The creatures are typically described as avoiding humans, with most sightings being brief glimpses before the creature moves away into heavy cover. Physical evidence beyond footprints has been limited. Hair samples that can't be identified have occasionally been found, but DNA testing typically reveals they're from known animals like bears or humans, or are too degraded for analysis. No bones or bodies have ever been found, which skeptics argue is the most damning evidence against Bigfoot's existence. A breeding population of large primates should leave behind remains, they argue, yet after decades of searching, nothing definitive has been discovered. The debate over Bigfoot's possible identity, if it exists, has produced several theories. Some suggest it could be a surviving population of Gigantopithecus, a giant ape that lived in Asia until about 100,000 years ago. Fossils show Gigantopithecus stood up to 10 feet tall and weighed up to 1,200 pounds. However, there's no fossil evidence that Gigantopithecus ever lived in North America, and explaining how a population could have crossed from Asia and survived undetected for thousands of years presents significant problems. Others propose that Bigfoot might be a surviving population of an ancient human ancestor, perhaps a line of Homo erectus that evolved to be larger and more adapted to cold climates. This theory has the advantage of explaining the creature's apparent intelligence and tool use that some witnesses report, but faces the same problem. No fossil evidence supports the presence of such hominids in the Americas during the relevant time periods. The skeptical explanation for Bigfoot sightings involves a combination of misidentification, hoaxes, and the power of suggestion. Bears standing on their hind legs account for many sightings, particularly at distance or in poor lighting. People in costumes explain some encounters. And once the idea of Bigfoot exists in an area, witnesses primed to expect the creature might interpret ambiguous sensory information as confirming what they're looking for. Yet the phenomenon persists, and not just among believers. Scientists occasionally take the possibility seriously enough to investigate. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, has extensively studied purported Bigfoot footprints and argues that some show anatomical details consistent with a real biological foot rather than a carved fake. Dr. Jane Goodall, the famous primatologist, has said she's sure creatures like Bigfoot exist, based on the consistent nature of reports from credible witnesses. Some cryptids are ancient, woven into human culture for thousands of years. Others appear suddenly, burst into public consciousness with a flurry of concentrated sightings, and then vanish almost as quickly as they arrived. The Mothman belongs to this second category, a creature that appeared in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, in 1966, terrified a community for 13 months, and then disappeared after the town's worst disaster, leaving behind one of cryptozoology's most unsettling mysteries. The first reported encounter occurred on November 12, 1966, though it wouldn't become public until several days later. 5 men were digging a grave in a cemetery near Clendenin, West Virginia, when they reported seeing a brown, human-like figure lift off from nearby trees and fly overhead. They described it as having wings, but definitely not being a bird. The men were reluctant to report what they'd seen, fearing ridicule, and the incident might have been forgotten if not for what happened 3 days later. On the night of November 15, 1966, 2 young married couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Mallette, were driving together near the abandoned North Power Plant, a World War II-era TNT factory on the outskirts of Point Pleasant. The area was known locally as the TNT area and consisted of numerous abandoned concrete structures hidden among overgrown vegetation, a place where local teenagers sometimes went for privacy or to explore. As the 2 couples drove past the plant's entrance, they noticed 2 large red lights near the old generator building. At first, they thought they might be reflectors, but as they got closer, they realized with horror that the lights were eyes, and those eyes belonged to a creature unlike anything they'd seen before. It stood between 6 and 7 feet tall, gray or brown in color, with a large, muscular body but no visible head. The eyes appeared to be set into its shoulders or upper chest area. Most disturbingly, it had large wings folded against its back. The creature moved toward them, and Roger Scarberry, who was driving, immediately sped away. As they drove toward Point Pleasant at speeds reportedly exceeding 100 miles per hour, they claimed the creature took flight and followed them, keeping pace with the car despite their speed. It didn't flap its wings constantly, but seemed to glide, occasionally making a squeaking or mechanical sound. The couple saw it twice more during their panicked drive back to town before it finally broke off pursuit. Terrified and shaking, they went directly to the Mason County Courthouse to report what they'd seen to Deputy Millard Halstead. The deputy later said the 2 couples were genuinely frightened, not joking or intoxicated. He drove back to the TNT area with them, but they found no trace of the creature. However, Halstead did report that his police radio experienced unusual interference while they were in the area. The story hit the local paper, the Point Pleasant Register, the next day. Reporter Mary Heyer, who would become central to documenting the Mothman phenomenon, wrote the initial article. The creature still had no name at that point, but when the story was picked up by the Associated Press, a newspaper editor coined the term Mothman, inspired by the Batman television series that was popular at the time. Once the first sighting became public, more witnesses came forward, and new sightings began occurring with alarming frequency. Over the next 13 months, more than 100 people in and around Point Pleasant reported seeing the Mothman or experiencing strange phenomena possibly related to it. The descriptions remained remarkably consistent. A tall, gray or brown figure with no visible head, large red glowing eyes, and enormous wings, sometimes described as spanning 10 feet or more. Many witnesses reported similar details about their encounters. The creature often appeared near the TNT area or along Route 62. It frequently paced vehicles traveling at high speeds. Many witnesses described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread or being psychologically affected by their encounters, experiencing nightmares or anxiety in the days following. Some reported temporary problems with their vision after looking into the creature's red eyes. Several witnesses mentioned hearing a mechanical or electronic sound associated with the creature. The sightings weren't limited to nighttime. On November 24, 1966, two volunteer firefighters, Paul Yoder and Benjamin Enochs, saw the creature standing in a field in broad daylight. On November 25, Thomas Urry was driving along Route 62 when a tall gray figure standing in a field suddenly spread enormous wings and rose straight up into the air, following his car for several miles. Urry told investigators the creature kept up with his car as he drove between 70 and 75 miles per hour. The phenomenon expanded beyond just Mothman sightings. Point Pleasant residents reported seeing unusual lights in the sky, experiencing telephone problems, finding strange footprints, and having encounters with mysterious dark-suited men who asked odd questions about the sightings. Some witnesses reported seeing dark, unmarked helicopters flying low over the TNT area. The atmosphere in the small town became increasingly tense as more and more people had unexplainable experiences. Not everyone who looked into the Mothman was a believer. Skeptics proposed various explanations for the sightings. The most popular skeptical theory suggested that witnesses were seeing sandhill cranes, large birds that stand about 5 feet tall, have red patches around their eyes, and have a wingspan that can reach 7 feet. Sandhill cranes are not native to West Virginia, but could theoretically have been blown off course during migration. However, this explanation struggled to account for the creature's reported ability to fly at extremely high speeds or its glowing eyes that shone like spotlights in the dark. Dr. Robert L. Smith, a wildlife biologist at West Virginia University, also suggested the sandhill crane theory, though he acknowledged it didn't perfectly fit all the witness descriptions. Other skeptics proposed owls, particularly barn owls whose white faces and dark eyes might appear eerie in certain lighting conditions. Some suggested the whole phenomenon was mass hysteria, with legitimate sightings of ordinary animals being exaggerated, and then inspiring copycat reports from people who wanted attention or simply convinced themselves they'd seen something unusual. The Mothman sightings might have eventually faded into local legend, if not for what happened on December 15, 1967. The Silver Bridge, a suspension bridge connecting Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, was filled with rush-hour traffic when a critical eyebar in the suspension chain snapped. Within seconds, the bridge collapsed into the Ohio River, taking 46 people to their deaths. It was one of the deadliest bridge disasters in American history, and it traumatized the small community of Point Pleasant. In the aftermath of the disaster, some witnesses claimed they'd seen the Mothman on or near the Silver Bridge in the days before it collapsed. Others recalled unusual bird activity around the bridge. These retroactive connections between the Mothman and the bridge collapse gave rise to the theory that the creature was somehow a harbinger of disaster, appearing to warn of impending tragedy or perhaps even causing it through some unknown mechanism. John Keel, a journalist who investigated the Mothman phenomenon extensively and wrote the book, The Mothman Prophecies, suggested that the creature was connected to the bridge disaster and to other strange phenomena reported in Point Pleasant during those 13 months. Keel proposed that the Mothman wasn't a simple flesh and blood creature, but something far stranger, perhaps an interdimensional being or a manifestation of some form of energy that humans couldn't understand. His book, published in 1975, brought the Mothman story to a national audience and cemented its place in American folklore. After the Silver Bridge collapse, Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant effectively ceased. This sudden end to a concentrated flap of sightings is unusual in cryptozoology and has fueled speculation about the creature's nature and purpose. If it was a real animal, did it simply move on to another location? If it was somehow connected to the bridge disaster, as some theorized, did its purpose end when the tragedy occurred? Occasional Mothman sightings have been reported from other locations over the decades since Point Pleasant. Some reports have come from areas that later experienced disasters, lending support to the Harbinger theory. Before the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster, some workers reported seeing a dark, bird-like creature with red eyes near the plant. Similar creatures have been reported before other tragedies, though these accounts are often difficult to verify and frequently emerge only after the disasters occur, raising questions about their reliability. The skeptical explanation for the Mothman phenomenon focuses on several factors. Point Pleasant in the 1960s was a small, close-knit community where stories spread quickly. Once the initial sighting was publicized, people were primed to interpret unusual experiences as Mothman encounters. The TNT area, with its abandoned buildings and mysterious history, provided a perfect setting for imagination to run wild. The stress of the bridge collapse might have caused people to retroactively connect unrelated events to create a narrative that made the senseless tragedy feel more meaningful or explicable. Yet the witnesses remained convinced of what they'd seen. Many were respected community members with no reason to fabricate stories. They described their encounters in specific, detailed ways that suggested genuine experiences, even if those experiences might have been misidentifications or misinterpretations of ordinary phenomena. The psychological impact on witnesses was real, regardless of what caused it. Today, Point Pleasant has embraced its connection to the Mothman. A large metallic statue of the creature stands in the town center, and the Mothman Museum preserves artifacts and accounts from the original sightings. An annual Mothman festival draws thousands of visitors. The town has transformed a frightening 13 months into a cultural identity, finding a way to honor both the tragedy of the Silver Bridge and the mystery of the creature that haunted their community. The Mothman remains one of cryptozoology's most enigmatic cases. Unlike Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, which have long, sustained histories of sightings, Mothman appeared suddenly, concentrated in one location for a specific period, and then vanished. This unusual pattern makes it harder to explain as a biological creature, but also more difficult to dismiss as simple misidentification. Whatever flew through Point Pleasant skies in 1966 and 1967, it left an indelible mark on those who saw it and created one of America's most enduring modern mysteries. Some cryptids burst onto the scene with modern sightings, while others have roots that stretch back through centuries of local folklore. The Jersey Devil belongs to this second category, with a legend that supposedly begins in 1735 and continues to this day, making it one of America's oldest continuously reported cryptids. The creature has become so associated with New Jersey that the state's NHL team bears its name. and the Pine Barrens, where it reportedly dwells, remain one of the eastern United States' most mysterious landscapes. The legend traditionally begins with a woman known as Mother Leeds, though the details vary depending on which version of the story you encounter. The most common version states that Mother Leeds, living in the Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey, discovered she was pregnant with her 13th child in 1735. Exhausted by poverty and the burden of raising 12 children, she supposedly cursed the unborn baby, crying out, "Let this one be a devil." When the child was born, according to legend, it initially appeared normal. But moments after birth, the infant began to transform. Its body elongated and changed, growing wings like a bat, hooves like a horse, a forked tail, and a head that resembled a horse or a dog with a horrible, inhuman face. The creature attacked everyone in the room, killing the midwife and Mother Leeds's other children before flying up the chimney and escaping into the Pine Barrens, where it has allegedly lived ever since. Historians and folklorists have attempted to trace the origins of this legend, and the trail leads in several directions. Some researchers point to a real person, Deborah Leeds, who married a man named Japhet Leeds in the early 18th century. The Leeds family was prominent in southern New Jersey, and some members were involved in political and religious controversies. The devil child story might have originated as propaganda against the Leeds family by their opponents, later transforming into supernatural folklore. Another theory connects the legend to Benjamin Franklin, who had a political rival named Daniel Leeds. Leeds published almanacs that competed with Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. Franklin allegedly referred to Leeds as a monster in print, and some researchers suggest this historical conflict may have contributed to the development of the Jersey Devil legend. However, this theory has the timeline wrong, as Daniel Leeds died in 1720, 15 years before the traditional date of the devil's birth. Regardless of its murky origins, the Jersey Devil legend became firmly embedded in Pine Barrens culture. The Pine Barrens themselves contributed to the legend's persistence. This million-acre wilderness of dense forests, sandy soil, cedar swamps, and winding waterways covers much of southern New Jersey. It's a landscape that seems frozen in time, where visibility is limited by thick vegetation, where sounds carry strangely through the trees, and where it's easy to become disoriented and lost. Before modern development, it was even more isolated and mysterious, a place where strange things could hide. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, occasional reports emerged of strange encounters in the Pine Barrens. Joseph Bonaparte, brother of Napoleon and former King of Spain, lived in Bordentown, New Jersey, from 1816 to 1839. According to legend, while hunting in the Pine Barrens one day, he encountered a strange creature with a horse-like head, bat wings, and a serpentine body. Commodore Stephen Decatur, a naval hero, allegedly saw a bizarre creature flying over a weapons testing site at Hanover Iron Works in the early 1800s, and supposedly even fired a cannonball at it, which passed directly through the creature without apparent effect. The most intense wave of Jersey Devil sightings occurred during one extraordinary week in January 1909, often called the Phenomenal Week. During this period, thousands of people across New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, and Delaware reported seeing the creature or finding its unusual tracks in the snow. The sightings were so numerous and came from so many apparently credible witnesses that newspapers across the region covered the story extensively. On January 16, 1909, the Bristol Courier reported that strange tracks had been found in the snow in Bristol, Pennsylvania. The tracks were described as resembling cloven hooves and had appeared on rooftops, in enclosed courtyards, and in other locations that seemed impossible for any earthbound animal to reach. On January 19, Mr. and Mrs. Nelson Evans of Gloucester City reported seeing the creature from their window around 2:30 a.m. They described it as about 3.5 feet tall, with a head like a collie dog, a horse-like face, a long neck, wings about 2 feet long, and legs with hooves like a horse. The same night, 2 Gloucester City residents found tracks in their yards and followed them to the roof of a shed. In Camden, a police officer named Louis Strayer claimed he shot at the creature, and several people heard unearthly screams echoing through the streets. In Haddon Heights, the creature supposedly attacked a trolley car, and in Riverside, residents reported that their dogs refused to go outside, cowering in fear. By January 20, the phenomenon had reached fever pitch. Schools closed in Mount Ephraim and some other towns because parents were afraid to send their children out. Some businesses temporarily shut down. Posses formed to hunt the creature. The Philadelphia Zoo offered a $10,000 reward for the creature's capture, dead or alive. Factories in Camden and other cities allowed workers to stay home because they were too frightened to walk to work in the dark. The descriptions from the 1909 sightings varied somewhat, but generally included certain consistent elements. The creature walked on 2 legs with hoofed feet, had large bat-like wings, possessed a long neck and a head that was frequently compared to a horse or a dog, had a forked or pointed tail, and made terrible shrieking or screaming sounds. Some witnesses estimated it at 3 to 4 feet tall, while others described it as larger. Many mentioned glowing eyes and a sulfurous smell. The panic ended almost as suddenly as it began. By the end of January, sightings had dropped off dramatically. Skeptics were quick to point out that during the height of the phenomenon, several hoaxes had been perpetrated. A Philadelphia man attached a painted kangaroo with artificial wings to a chain and charged people admission to see the captured Jersey Devil. Another exhibit featuring a creature was exposed as a painted dog. These revelations, combined with more measured reporting in newspapers, helped deflate the hysteria. Skeptical explanations for the 1909 wave focused on mass hysteria and hoaxes. Once the initial reports gained attention, every strange sound in the night, every unusual track in the snow, every glimpse of an animal in the dark could be interpreted as the Jersey Devil. People were primed to see the creature, and their expectations shaped their perceptions. The tracks on rooftops and in enclosed areas could have been made by raccoons, opossums, or cats, which are all capable of reaching such locations. The creature sightings themselves might have been misidentifications of large birds like herons or cranes, which can appear quite strange in silhouette and poor lighting. However, the sheer number of reports from apparently credible witnesses gave pause even to skeptics. Police officers, government officials, and prominent citizens all claimed to have seen something unusual during that week in January. While mass hysteria can explain some of the reports, explaining all of them as simple misidentification or fabrication requires assuming widespread dishonesty or delusion among a large cross-section of the population. After 1909, Jersey Devil sightings continued sporadically. In 1927, a taxi driver reported seeing the creature near Pine Barrens. In the 1930s, various people reported encounters. During the 1950s and 60s, occasional sightings kept the legend alive. In 1966, a merchant in Woodstown reported finding tracks that couldn't be identified. In 1993, a park ranger in Wharton State Forest, which encompasses much of the Pine Barrens, claimed to see a creature matching the Jersey Devil description. The most recent significant wave of sightings occurred in 2015, when a resident of Little Egg Harbor Township shared a photograph allegedly showing the Jersey Devil. The image, taken at night, showed a strange winged creature. However, analysis suggested the photo was likely a hoax or misidentification, possibly showing a large bird or even a drone. What might the Jersey Devil be if it's not simply folklore and hoaxes? Several naturalistic explanations have been proposed. The sandhill crane theory appears frequently, as these large birds with 6 to 7 foot wingspans are not native to the area but could theoretically appear as vagrants. Their call is described as a loud, trumpeting cry that could be mistaken for something monstrous. However, sandhill cranes don't have horse-like heads or hoofed feet, making this explanation incomplete at best. Some researchers have suggested that witnesses might be seeing owls, particularly great horned owls or barn owls, which can appear quite strange in silhouette and have eerie calls. Others have proposed that some sightings might involve pterosaur-like creatures that somehow survived extinction, though this raises obvious questions about breeding populations and fossil evidence. The legend might also preserve folk memory of real extinct animals. The Pine Barrens once had different fauna before European settlement. Some cryptozoologists have speculated that descriptions of the Jersey Devil might be distorted memories or accounts of now extinct species, though no candidate species fits the bill particularly well. More prosaically, the Jersey Devil might be entirely folklore, a legend that serves psychological and cultural functions for the communities of southern New Jersey. The creature represents the Pine Barrens themselves, a wild landscape that resists complete human control. It's a reminder that even in the densely populated northeastern United States, there are still places of mystery, still wilderness that holds secrets. The Jersey Devil has become a cultural touchstone for New Jersey, appearing in literature, television, movies, and popular culture. The New Jersey Devils hockey team has made the creature a beloved mascot. The legend brings tourism to the Pine Barrens and gives the state a unique piece of folklore that distinguishes it from its neighbors. In this sense, the Jersey Devil serves a function regardless of its physical reality. It defines a place and gives it character. When European colonists first arrived in North America, indigenous peoples shared stories that the newcomers found difficult to believe. Accounts of birds so large they could carry off deer or even humans, creatures whose wingbeats sounded like thunder and whose eyes flashed with lightning. These stories were dismissed as mythology, the exaggerations of peoples without scientific understanding. Yet even today, reports continue to emerge of enormous birds that don't match any known species, birds that seem to have flown straight out of indigenous legend and into modern skies. The Thunderbird appears in the traditions of numerous indigenous nations across North America, from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Plains to the eastern woodlands. While details vary among different cultures, certain elements remain consistent. The Thunderbird is an enormous bird of prey, often described as being as large as several men, with wings that create thunder when they flap and lightning flashing from its eyes or beak. It's a powerful spiritual being, sometimes benevolent and protective, sometimes dangerous and capricious. In Pacific Northwest traditions, particularly among the Kwakwaka'wakwa, Nuu-chah-nulth, and Coast Salish peoples, the Thunderbird was a major figure in cosmology. It lived in the mountains and hunted whales, carrying them back to its mountain home. Totem poles frequently featured Thunderbird imagery, and families claimed descent from Thunderbird ancestors. The bird was associated with power, nobility, and the upper world of sky and mountains, contrasted with the underwater realm of supernatural serpents and whales. For Great Plains nations like the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples, the Thunderbird, called Wakinian, was sacred and mysterious. It was associated with storms, war, and protection. Warriors who had visions of Thunderbirds held special status and often wore Thunderbird symbols on their shields and clothing. The bird was seen as a manifestation of divine power, capable of both creation and destruction. Eastern woodland nations also had Thunderbird traditions. The Algonquin peoples knew the creature as Animikiai. The Iroquois Confederacy spoke of similar beings. Cherokee traditions mentioned large birds associated with storms and supernatural power. These weren't mere metaphors for weather phenomena, but were understood as actual beings that existed in both the physical and spiritual realms. The question that interests cryptozoologists is whether these consistent traditions across diverse cultures might preserve some memory of real, extraordinarily large birds that once existed in North America. The continent did have such birds in the relatively recent past. Teratorns, a family of giant birds of prey, lived in the Americas until about 10,000 years ago. Argentavis magnificens, which lived in South America, had a wingspan estimated at up to 21 feet. In North America, Teratornis merriami had a wingspan of approximately 12 feet, making it substantially larger than any modern bird. These teratorns went extinct at the end of the last ice age, along with many other megafauna. However, 10,000 years is recent enough that early human inhabitants of the Americas could have encountered them. Could indigenous traditions of thunderbirds preserve cultural memory of these actual giant birds? This theory is intriguing, but faces challenges. 10,000 years is a very long time for oral traditions to preserve specific details, and the extinction of teratorns predates the development of many aspects of indigenous cultures as we know them. Nevertheless, reports of giant birds that might be thunderbirds continue into the present day. In 1977, one of the most famous modern sightings occurred in Lawndale, Illinois. On July 25, Marlon Lowe was playing in his yard when two enormous birds appeared overhead. According to multiple witnesses, including Marlon's mother Ruth, one of the birds swooped down and grabbed the 10-year-old boy, lifting him several feet off the ground and carrying him some distance before dropping him, apparently because the boy struggled so violently. The birds were described as black with white rings around their long necks, with curved beaks and wingspans estimated at 8 to 10 feet. They made no sound during the attack. After dropping Marlon, the birds flew off toward the southwest. The boy was terrified but physically unharmed. The story made national news, and while some dismissed it as an exaggeration or mistake, the witnesses included multiple adults who insisted on what they'd seen. Investigators suggested that the birds might have been turkey vultures or California condors. Turkey vultures are common in Illinois and can have wingspans up to 6 feet. California condors, which can have wingspans up to 10 feet, are not native to Illinois but could theoretically appear as vagrants. However, neither species is known for attacking humans, and neither matches the described appearance perfectly, particularly the white neck rings. Pennsylvania has produced numerous giant bird reports over the decades. In 2001, several people in Greenville reported seeing a bird with a 15 to 20-foot wingspan. The witnesses were adamant that it was far larger than any known bird species. Similar reports have come from other parts of Pennsylvania, often from the rural areas of the state. In 2002, a man driving through Alaska reported seeing a bird with an estimated wingspan of 14 feet perched on a tree. The bird was dark-colored and watched him intently before taking flight. Alaska, with its vast wilderness and relatively sparse human population, seems like a plausible location for undiscovered large birds, if such creatures exist. One of the challenges in evaluating Thunderbird reports is the difficulty humans have in estimating size, particularly wingspan, especially when startled or frightened. A 6-foot wingspan can appear much larger when a bird passes directly overhead or when seen briefly in surprising circumstances. Perspective and lack of reference points can make ordinary large birds seem extraordinary. Our brains aren't wired to accurately judge the size of flying objects, particularly when we're not expecting to see them. The largest confirmed flying bird in North America is the California condor, with a wingspan that can reach 9.8 feet. The wandering albatross holds the record for the largest wingspan of any living bird at up to 11.5 feet, though it's not found in North America. For a bird to qualify as a true Thunderbird based on most eyewitness descriptions, it would need to exceed these measurements significantly, having a wingspan of perhaps 15 to 20 feet or more. Could such birds exist undetected? Birds require substantial food sources, and large birds of prey need correspondingly large hunting territories. A breeding population of giant birds would need to be sizable enough to maintain genetic diversity, making it unlikely they could remain completely hidden. Birds are also highly visible creatures by their nature, flying in open skies where they're exposed to observation. Unlike ground-dwelling cryptids that might hide in dense forests, giant birds would presumably be spotted regularly if they existed in any numbers. However, the vastness of North America shouldn't be underestimated. Canada and Alaska contain enormous stretches of remote wilderness rarely visited by humans. Even in the lower 48 states, substantial wild areas remain. The ivory-billed woodpecker, once thought extinct, generated credible reports in Arkansas in 2004, though these sightings remain controversial. If a bird previously thought extinct could potentially survive undetected, might unknown species also persist in remote areas? Some cryptozoologists have proposed that thunderbirds might not be completely unknown, but rather extant pterosaurs, flying reptiles that supposedly went extinct 66 million years ago. This theory faces enormous scientific obstacles. The fossil record shows no evidence of pterosaurs surviving the extinction event that killed the non-avian dinosaurs. The evolutionary gap between pterosaurs and modern birds is vast, and suggesting they survived for 66 million years without leaving any fossil evidence stretches credibility beyond the breaking point. The cultural significance of Thunderbird imagery in indigenous art and tradition cannot be overstated. The bird appears on totem poles, in paintings, in ceremonies, and in stories passed down through generations. For many indigenous peoples, the Thunderbird isn't simply a large bird, but a spiritual being that embodies fundamental forces of nature, and serves as a connection between the human and spirit worlds. Reducing these rich traditions to simple misidentification of ordinary birds or extinct species does a disservice to their cultural and spiritual depth. Yet the question remains, why do people continue to report seeing impossibly large birds? Psychology offers several explanations. Misidentification of known large birds under unusual circumstances can create reports that seem to describe something extraordinary. Cultural priming, where knowledge of Thunderbird legends influences interpretation of ambiguous observations, plays a role. The desire for mystery and discovery might lead some people to exaggerate what they've seen or to interpret uncertain observations in the most exciting possible way. The Thunderbird, perhaps more than any other cryptid, exists in the space between physical reality and spiritual significance. For indigenous peoples who maintain traditional beliefs, questioning whether Thunderbirds are real misses the point. They are real in the ways that matter most, as spiritual truths and cultural touchstones. For cryptozoologists, the consistent reports of giant birds across time and geography suggest something worth investigating, even if that something turns out to be misidentified known species rather than undiscovered animals. What the Thunderbird teaches us is that sometimes the most important mysteries aren't solved by finding physical specimens or capturing definitive photographs. Sometimes the mystery itself serves a purpose, reminding us that our scientific understanding, comprehensive as it is, doesn't encompass everything humans have experienced or everything that matters in human culture. The Thunderbird flies through our skies and our imaginations, whether as flesh and blood or as living mythology, carrying thunder in its wings and questions we may never fully answer. Unlike ancient cryptids steeped in centuries of tradition, the Chupacabra is remarkably recent, bursting into public consciousness in the mid-1990s before spreading across Latin America and into the southern United States with remarkable speed. The creature's name literally means goat sucker in Spanish, referring to its alleged habit of draining blood from livestock, particularly goats. What makes the Chupacabra particularly fascinating is how rapidly it became embedded in popular culture, and how its description evolved and changed as reports spread geographically. The first reported Chupacabra attacks occurred in March 1995 in Puerto Rico. 8 sheep were discovered dead in the town of Orocavis, each with 3 puncture wounds in the chest area and appearing to have been drained of blood. This was unusual enough to generate local interest. But what happened over the following months transformed a strange incident into an island-wide phenomenon. Throughout 1995, reports of similar attacks spread across Puerto Rico. Hundreds of animals were found dead, primarily goats, chickens, and other small livestock, often with puncture wounds and seemingly drained of blood. Farmers were terrified and angry, losing valuable animals to something they couldn't identify or defend against. The media covered the phenomenon extensively, and the name Chupacabra emerged to describe whatever was responsible. In August 1995, the creature itself was allegedly seen for the first time. Madeline Tolentino, a resident of Canavanas, Puerto Rico, reported looking out her window and seeing a bizarre creature unlike anything she'd encountered before. Her description would become the template for the classic Chupacabra appearance. Roughly humanoid but clearly not human, standing about 4 to 5 feet tall, with large, distinctive eyes that were either red or black, grayish-green skin, and a row of spines or quills running down its back. It had thin, long arms with clawed hands and powerful legs that allowed it to hop or jump rather than walk normally. Other witnesses came forward with similar descriptions, though details varied. Some reported that the creature had wings or at least membrane-like appendages that might allow it to glide. Others described a more reptilian appearance, with scaly skin and features suggesting something prehistoric. Some witnesses reported a sulfurous smell associated with the creature. Many mentioned that it moved with remarkable speed and could make impressive leaps, reportedly jumping over fences and walls with ease. The phenomenon quickly spread beyond Puerto Rico. By 1996, similar reports were coming from Mexico, with dead livestock found under circumstances that matched the Puerto Rican cases. The creature's reported range expanded through Central and South America, with sightings and alleged attacks in Costa Rica, Chile, Argentina, and other nations. Each region seemed to add its own details to the creature's description, but the core elements remained consistent: an unknown predator that killed livestock and drained their blood through small puncture wounds. In the United States, Chupacabra reports began appearing in the late 1990s and early 2000s, primarily in states with significant Hispanic populations and those bordering Mexico, particularly Texas, Arizona, and Southern California. However, the creature described in these U.S. sightings often differed significantly from the original Puerto Rican accounts. Rather than the alien-like bipedal creature with spines, U.S. witnesses frequently described something that looked more like a hairless dog or coyote with mange, with grayish-blue skin, a pronounced spinal ridge, and an unusual gait. This divergence in descriptions created what cryptozoologists call the two Chupacabra problem. Were these reports describing the same creature, or had the name become attached to multiple different animals? The Puerto Rican descriptions suggested something truly anomalous, possibly even extraterrestrial in origin. The U.S. descriptions, while unusual, seemed more compatible with known animals, particularly canines suffering from disease. Several alleged Chupacabra specimens have been found, examined, and tested over the years. Invariably, these have turned out to be known animals, usually coyotes or dogs suffering from severe mange. Mange is a skin disease caused by parasitic mites that burrow into the skin, causing hair loss, thickened skin, and secondary infections. Animals with severe mange can look genuinely disturbing, appearing almost alien with their hairless, discolored skin and emaciated bodies. In 2007, a woman in Curo, Texas, discovered a strange hairless creature on her property and managed to shoot and preserve it. The animal looked like nothing she'd seen before, with strange features and blue-gray skin. DNA testing revealed it was a coyote with severe mange. Similar cases have occurred in Texas and other states multiple times, with each Chupacabra specimen ultimately identified as a mange-afflicted canine. This scientific explanation satisfies skeptics but leaves believers with questions. If the U.S. specimens are just sick coyotes, what about the original Puerto Rican creature with its bipedal stance, spines, and alien-like features? Could there be two different phenomena that became conflated under the same name? Or did the original descriptions in Puerto Rico also involve misidentification, perhaps of animals unknown to the witnesses? The drained blood aspect of Chupacabra killings has been a particular point of skepticism. Forensic veterinary examination of allegedly attacked animals has consistently shown that the animals weren't actually drained of blood. Blood pools in the lowest parts of a carcass after death, and if predators or scavengers feed on the internal organs, the blood disperses or is consumed. The puncture wounds often attributed to the Chupacabra can be made by various predators, including feral dogs, foxes, or even large birds of prey. The absence of visible blood on the ground doesn't mean the blood was drained externally. It means it was consumed or absorbed internally. Some researchers have suggested that the original Chupacabra reports might have been inspired by the 1995 science fiction film Species, which featured an alien creature with some visual similarities to early Chupacabra descriptions. Madeline Tolentino, who provided the influential first physical description, had apparently seen the film shortly before her sighting. This has led skeptics to propose that the Chupacabra is essentially a case of life imitating art, with people seeing a fictional monster in ambiguous real-world encounters. Cultural factors certainly contributed to the Chupacabra's rapid spread. Latin American folklore already included various blood-drinking creatures and mysterious livestock predators. The Chupacabra filled a cultural niche that was already prepared to receive it. Economic factors mattered too. Small farmers losing livestock to predation faced genuine hardship, and blaming deaths on a mysterious monster might have been easier than acknowledging more prosaic causes like stray dogs, which could implicate neighbors. The media played a crucial role in spreading and amplifying the phenomenon. News coverage of Chupacabra sightings drew attention and created expectations. Once the creature became famous, people had a framework for interpreting unexplained animal deaths or unusual creatures they encountered. This created a feedback loop where increased attention led to more reports, which generated more coverage, which inspired more attention to any potentially related incidents. The Chupacabra has become firmly embedded in popular culture, appearing in television shows, movies, books, and even as sports team mascots. The creature has become a symbol of Latin American cryptozoology, and for some, a representation of cultural identity and resistance to mainstream scientific authority. The government's dismissal of Chupacabra reports as hysteria or ignorance resonated poorly in communities where trust in official institutions was already low. What's particularly interesting about the Chupacabra from a folkloristic perspective is how quickly it went from contemporary phenomenon to modern legend. Most cryptids have histories measured in centuries. The Chupacabra went from first report to global recognition in just a few years. It's a case study in how legends form and spread in the age of mass media and instant communication. Long before the modern age of exploration mapped every ocean in depth, sailors told tales of a creature so immense it could drag entire ships to their doom. The Kraken, as this monster came to be known in Scandinavian waters, represented the ocean's ultimate terror, a beast large enough to wrap its tentacles around a vessel and pull it beneath the waves, leaving no survivors to tell the tale except those who witnessed the attack from neighboring ships. What makes the Kraken unique among cryptids is that science eventually caught up with the legend, revealing that something very much like the Kraken does exist in the deep ocean. The earliest descriptions of kraken-like creatures come from ancient sources. Aristotle mentioned enormous cephalopods, though his accounts are vague and possibly based on fishermen's tales. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, described giant octopuses capable of attacking ships. These ancient accounts set the template for later kraken legends. Massive tentacled creatures lurking in the deep, dangerous to sailors who encountered them. The creature became particularly prominent in Scandinavian folklore, where it was known as Kraken in Norwegian and Krabben in Swedish. These names possibly derive from krake, meaning an unhealthy or crooked animal, or from kraki, Old Norse for pole or post, perhaps referring to the creature's tentacles reaching up like posts from the water. Early Scandinavian accounts described the kraken as being so large that sailors might mistake it for an island. The creature would allegedly float on the surface, and unwary sailors might land on its back, only to have it suddenly submerge, drowning everyone aboard. The Danish historian Erik Pontoppidan published one of the most influential early accounts of the kraken in his Natural History of Norway in 1752. Pontoppidan described the creature as being approximately 2.5 kilometers in circumference, essentially the size of a floating island. He reported that the kraken would lie still on the surface, sometimes with its back above water, and unwary sailors might mistake it for land. When it sensed danger or decided to feed, it would dive rapidly, creating a massive whirlpool that could pull down ships in the vicinity. Pontoppidan also described the kraken's feeding habits, noting that it would release a murky substance into the water that attracted fish in vast numbers. The creature would then rise through this school of fish with its mouth open, consuming enormous quantities. This detail is particularly interesting because it somewhat resembles the feeding strategy of some real large marine animals, suggesting Pontoppidan's account might have been based on observations of actual creatures, even if greatly exaggerated. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, reports of encounters with enormous cephalopods continued to emerge from sailors and whalers. Many of these accounts described creatures attacking ships or longboats, wrapping their arms around vessels and attempting to drag them down. The famous Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus initially included kraken in his taxonomic system as Microcosmos marinus, but later removed it, apparently deciding the evidence was insufficient. The French malacologist Pierre Denis de Montfort became a strong advocate for the kraken's existence in the early 1800s. He described two types: the kraken octopus, which supposedly attacked ships, and the colossal octopus, which was even larger. Montfort's work included illustrations of the creature attacking sailing vessels, with tentacles wrapped around masts and sailors being plucked from the deck. However, Montfort's credibility was damaged when he made increasingly outrageous claims, including that a specific naval defeat was caused by octopuses rather than enemy action. The turning point for kraken credibility came in November 1861, when the French steamer Electon encountered a large squid in the Atlantic Ocean near Tenerife in the Canary Islands. The crew attempted to capture the creature, and while they were only able to secure the tail end, this specimen provided physical proof that very large cephalopods existed. The tail portion was preserved and studied, offering tangible evidence that sailors' tales might have basis in fact. Throughout the 19th century, more evidence accumulated. Giant squids began washing ashore in various locations, particularly in Newfoundland in the 1870s. These specimens, while dead and often damaged, could be measured and studied. They were indeed enormous, with some individuals measuring over 40 feet long, including tentacles. Suddenly, the kraken didn't seem quite so mythical. Something very much like it existed in the deep ocean. The giant squid, known scientifically as Architeuthis, became the rational explanation for many kraken sightings. These creatures can grow to truly impressive sizes, with the largest confirmed specimens reaching lengths of 43 feet or more. They inhabit deep ocean waters and rarely come to the surface, which explained their rarity in human observation. Their powerful tentacles, lined with rotating hooks and sucker rings, could certainly damage smaller vessels if the animal felt threatened. However, giant squids don't fully account for all Kraken legends. The largest Architeuthis specimens, while impressive, aren't nearly large enough to threaten substantial sailing ships in the way the legends describe. For that, we need to look at an even larger species, the colossal squid, or Messinichotuthis hamiltoni. This species, discovered through specimens caught in deep-sea fishing operations, can grow even larger than the giant squid, with some estimates suggesting total lengths of up to 46 feet or more and weights exceeding 1,000 pounds. The colossal squid inhabits the deep waters around Antarctica and is even more rarely encountered than the giant squid. Only a handful of complete specimens have been examined. The largest known specimen, captured in 2007, had a mantle length of about 8 feet, with tentacles that extended the total length considerably. The creature's eyes were enormous, about 11 inches in diameter, the largest eyes of any known animal. These massive eyes suggest adaptation for seeing in the minimal light of deep ocean environments. Both giant and colossal squids possess powerful beaks capable of cutting through flesh and shell. Their arms are lined with suckers equipped with sharp hooks or rings of teeth. They're formidable predators, capable of taking down large fish and even small whales. Sperm whales, which dive to great depths to hunt, often bear circular scars from squid suckers, evidence of struggles in the deep ocean that humans never witness. The question remains, could squids of this size actually attack ships? The answer appears to be, probably not intentionally, but possibly in self-defense or confusion. Giant and colossal squids are adapted for life in the deep ocean where pressures are extreme. When they come to the surface, they're often dying or disoriented, possibly due to illness or changing ocean conditions. A disoriented giant squid encountering a boat might react defensively, potentially grasping at the vessel with its tentacles. For smaller boats, particularly historical wooden vessels, this could indeed be dangerous. Stories of even larger squid continue to circulate. Sperm whales have occasionally been found with sucker scars significantly larger than those that could be made by known giant or colossal squids, suggesting that even larger cephalopods might exist in the deepest ocean trenches. However, no specimens of such creatures have ever been captured or definitively photographed, and their existence remains speculative. The first photographs of a living giant squid in its natural habitat weren't obtained until 2004, when Japanese researchers Tsunemi Kubodra and Kyoichi Mori captured images of an Architeuthis attacking baited lines at a depth of 900 meters. Video footage of living giant squids followed in subsequent years. These images revealed graceful, almost alien creatures quite different from the aggressive ship destroyers of legend. They seemed more likely to flee from large objects than to attack them. The Kraken legend has proven remarkably durable in popular culture, appearing in countless books, movies, and games. The creature represents the ocean's mystery and danger, the unknown things that lurk in depths humans still haven't fully explored. Even today, with our advanced technology and extensive scientific knowledge, the deep ocean remains one of Earth's least understood environments. More humans have walked on the moon than have visited the deepest parts of the ocean. What the Kraken teaches us is that sometimes legends have foundations in reality, even if the reality doesn't quite match the most dramatic elements of the tale. Sailors really were encountering enormous tentacled creatures, even if those creatures weren't quite large enough to pull down sailing ships or mistake for islands. The transformation of the Kraken from legendary monster to confirmed species shows how cryptozoology can occasionally succeed, how the line between myth and reality can be more blurred than we might expect. Yet mysteries remain. The ocean is vast and deep, with countless species still undiscovered. While it seems unlikely that animals even larger than the colossal squid lurk in the depths, we can't entirely rule it out. The ocean has surprised us before and will undoubtedly surprise us again. The Kraken, in a sense, swims still in our imagination, reminding us that the planet we inhabit still holds secrets, still has places we haven't fully explored, still can surprise us with the scale and strangeness of life. Some places seem destined for mystery. Loch Ness, a deep, dark freshwater loch in the Scottish Highlands, has become synonymous with cryptozoology itself, home to perhaps the world's most famous cryptid, Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster. The creature's fame extends far beyond cryptozoology enthusiasts. It's recognized globally, has become integral to Scottish tourism, and represents the enduring human fascination with hidden animals in unexpected places. The story of Nessie is as much about hope, tourism economics, and human pattern recognition as it is about any possible creature in the loch's depths. Loch Ness itself is an imposing body of water. It's approximately 23 miles long and up to 1.5 miles wide, with a maximum depth of about 755 feet. It contains more fresh water than all the lakes in England and Wales combined. The water is dark, stained by peat from the surrounding highlands, limiting visibility to only a few feet even in optimal conditions. The loch is cold year-round, connected to the sea by the River Ness, and has steep sides that drop off dramatically from the shore. It's precisely the kind of place where large, secretive animals might theoretically hide undetected. References to unusual creatures in Loch Ness stretch back centuries. The earliest often cited account comes from the life of St. Columba, written around 565 CE by the abbot Adamnan. The text describes St. Columba encountering a water beast in the River Ness that had apparently killed a man. Columba commanded the beast to retreat, and it obeyed. This account is frequently cited by monster enthusiasts, though skeptics note that it occurred in the river, not the loch itself, and reads more like a hagiographic miracle story than a factual zoological observation. For centuries afterward, Loch Ness remained relatively quiet in terms of monster reports. Occasional stories circulated among highland communities about strange creatures or unexplained phenomena in the water, but these remained local folklore rather than national news. The modern Nessie phenomenon really begins in the 1930s, catalyzed by improved access to the area and one particularly influential newspaper article. In 1933, a road was completed along the loch's northern shore, opening the area to increased tourism and providing clear sightlines to the water that hadn't previously existed. On April 14, 1933, the Inverness Courier published an article titled "Strange Spectacle on Loch Ness," describing how a local couple, Mr. and Mrs. John Mackay, had seen an enormous animal rolling and plunging in the water. The article, written by Alex Campbell, who served as the water bailiff for Loch Ness, compared the creature to a whale. This article sparked widespread interest, and suddenly sightings began being reported regularly. Throughout 1933 and 1934, numerous people claimed to have seen something unusual in Loch Ness. The descriptions varied considerably. Some witnesses described humps moving through the water, others reported long necks and small heads. Some saw only disturbances in the water that suggested something large beneath the surface. The inconsistency in descriptions would become a persistent challenge for those trying to determine what, if anything, people were actually seeing. The most famous piece of Nessie evidence appeared in April 1934, the surgeon's photograph, taken by Robert Kenneth Wilson. The image shows what appears to be a long neck and small head protruding from the loch's surface, exactly matching popular conceptions of what the monster should look like. The photograph was published in the Daily Mail and became an instant sensation, cementing the image of Nessie as a plesiosaur-like creature in public imagination. For 60 years, the surgeon's photograph served as the primary visual evidence for the monster's existence. However, in 1994, the truth emerged. The photograph was a hoax, created using a toy submarine fitted with a sculpted head and neck. The hoax was perpetrated by Marmaduke Wetherell, a big game hunter whom the Daily Mail had hired to find the monster, but who had been humiliated when tracks he discovered were revealed to be made with a stuffed hippopotamus foot used as an umbrella stand. The photograph was his revenge on the newspaper, with Wilson serving as a willing accomplice to give the hoax credibility. Despite being revealed as fake, the image remains the iconic representation of the Loch Ness Monster. Nevertheless, sightings continued throughout the decades. In 1960, aeronautical engineer Tim Dinstall filmed what appeared to be a hump moving across the loch's surface, leaving a wake. The footage, while grainy and ambiguous, was analyzed by various experts, some of whom concluded it showed an animate object rather than a boat or inanimate debris. Dinstall became one of Nessie's most dedicated investigators, spending years searching the loch until his death in 1987. The 1970s brought serious scientific expeditions to Loch Ness. The Academy of Applied Science, led by Dr. Robert Rines, conducted extensive sonar surveys and underwater photography expeditions. In 1972, they obtained a famous underwater photograph that appeared to show a diamond-shaped flipper. Additional expeditions produced other intriguing sonar contacts and photographs, including one that seemed to show a long-necked creature. However, subsequent analysis suggested the images might show inanimate objects, possibly tree stumps or rocks, distorted by water conditions and photographic enhancement. Operation Deepscan in 1987 represented the most comprehensive sonar survey of Loch Ness to that point. 24 boats equipped with sonar equipment swept the loch in formation, scanning from shore to shore. The survey detected several large, unusual sonar contacts that couldn't be immediately explained, but none definitively proved the existence of a large, unknown animal. The expedition's leaders concluded that while they couldn't rule out the existence of something unusual in the loch, they also hadn't found conclusive evidence for it. Modern technology has continued to probe Loch Ness. Satellite surveillance, drone surveys, environmental DNA sampling, and sophisticated sonar have all been employed in the search for Nessie. In 2019, an international team led by Professor Neil Gemmell conducted extensive eDNA sampling, analyzing water samples from throughout the loch for traces of DNA that would indicate what species live there. The results showed no evidence of large unknown animals, though they did reveal a surprising amount of eel DNA, leading to speculation that some sightings might involve unusually large eels. So what might people be seeing when they report the Loch Ness Monster? Several prosaic explanations account for many sightings. Waves and wakes from boats can create patterns that resemble humps or moving objects, particularly when seen at distance or in certain lighting. Floating logs or debris can appear animal-like, especially when partially submerged. Swimming deer with their heads and necks above water have been photographed in the loch and can resemble the classic long neck Nessie image. Atmospheric conditions, particularly temperature inversions, can create optical illusions that distort objects or create mirages. Birds on the water's surface, seen at distance, can appear larger than they are. Such effects, standing waves that occur in enclosed bodies of water, can create unusual surface disturbances. The human brain's pattern recognition systems, primed by cultural expectations about what Nessie should look like, can interpret ambiguous visual information as confirming those expectations. The biological arguments against a breeding population of large unknown animals in Loch Ness are substantial. Any viable population would need to maintain sufficient numbers to avoid inbreeding, requiring at least several dozen individuals at minimum. These animals would need to eat, and calculations of the loch's biomass suggest it couldn't support large predators in significant numbers. The loch's coldness would require either warm-blooded creatures with high metabolic needs or cold-blooded animals that would be relatively inactive, complicating explanations for regular sightings. If Nessie were a surviving population of plesiosaurs, as the most romantic theory suggests, numerous problems arise. Plesiosaurs were marine reptiles that went extinct with the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. The fossil record shows no evidence of their survival beyond that point. Loch Ness itself is only about 10,000 years old, formed after the last ice age, meaning any creatures in it would have had to enter from the sea relatively recently. Plesiosaurs, if they somehow survived extinction, would have had to adapt to fresh water, hide completely from human observation for centuries, and maintain a breeding population without ever leaving obvious remains. The economic impact of the Loch Ness Monster on the region is substantial. Tourism brings millions of pounds to the Highlands annually, with many visitors coming specifically because of Nessie's fame. Boat tour, museums, visitor centers, and countless souvenir shops depend on the monster's continued appeal. This economic reality creates complicated incentives, where local businesses benefit from the mystery continuing, regardless of the creature's actual existence. Some researchers have suggested that the Loch Ness Monster represents a kind of collaborative fiction, a modern myth that communities create and maintain because it serves psychological and economic needs. The monster brings attention to a remote area, creates a sense of local identity and pride, and provides endless entertainment and speculation. In this view, whether Nessie physically exists matters less than the role the idea of Nessie plays in human culture. Yet witnesses continue to report sightings, many from people with no apparent motive to fabricate stories. Some of these witnesses are locals who have lived near the loch their entire lives and know its moods and patterns intimately. They insist they saw something that doesn't match any ordinary explanation. The challenge is distinguishing between genuine, unusual phenomena, misidentification of ordinary things under unusual conditions, and the human tendency to see what we expect or hope to see. Nessie has become more than a cryptid. It's a cultural icon, a symbol of mystery in an increasingly mapped and explained world. The creature represents the hope that there are still discoveries to be made, still surprises waiting in familiar places. Whether or not a large, unknown animal actually swims in Loch Ness, the legend serves a purpose, reminding us that certainty is elusive, and that the world might still harbor secrets that science hasn't yet revealed. As long as Loch Ness remains dark and deep, as long as its waters conceal what lies beneath, Nessie will continue to swim through human imagination, if nowhere else. High in the Himalayas, where the air grows thin and the landscape becomes a realm of ice and rock, local Sherpa and Tibetan peoples have long told stories of a creature that lives in the remote valleys and high passes. A large, ape-like being covered in hair, adapted to the brutal mountain environment, shy of humans, but occasionally encountered by travelers, hunters, or mountaineers. To the Sherpa, it's known as Yeti, which roughly translates to rock bear or animal of rocky places. To the Western world, particularly after British colonial mountain expeditions began reporting on these legends, it became known as the Abominable Snowman, a name that captures both the creature's reported habitat and its fearsome reputation. The Yeti occupies a complex place in Himalayan culture. Different communities have different traditions surrounding these creatures, and not all are consistent. Some Sherpa distinguish between multiple types of Yeti. The Dziyute, a large, aggressive creature associated with lower valleys, the Mete, an intermediate form, and the Tlma, a smaller variant. These distinctions suggest a more nuanced understanding than simple monster mythology, possibly representing observations of different animals or different behaviors of the same species. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the Yeti occupies an ambiguous spiritual space. Some stories portray it as a wild creature, neither particularly spiritual nor demonic, simply another form of life adapted to harsh mountain conditions. Others suggest more supernatural qualities, linking Yetis to spirits or presenting them as beings with quasi-human intelligence. Some monasteries claim to possess Yeti artifacts, including scalps and hands, though scientific analysis has typically identified these as coming from known animals, usually various species of bears or goats. Western interest in the Yeti began in earnest during the 19th and early 20th centuries, as British military and civilian expeditions explored the Himalayas. In 1921, members of the Royal Geographic Society's Everest Reconnaissance Expedition reported seeing dark figures moving across distant snowfields. Through binoculars, they appeared to be large, upright animals. When the expedition reached the location, they found large footprints in the snow, much larger than human feet. The term abominable snowman emerged from a mistranslation. In 1921, Lt. Colonel Charles Howard Berry wrote about tracks found near the mountain Lac Pala. He reported that his Sherpa guides called the creature Meadow Kangmi, which he translated as Wild Man of the Snows. A journalist reporting on the expedition mistranslated Meadow, which actually means man-bear, as filthy or abominable, and thus the abominable snowman entered popular consciousness, despite being a somewhat inaccurate rendering of the original Tibetan concept. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, mountaineering expeditions to the Himalayas increasingly reported finding unusual footprints in the snow at high altitudes. These tracks were consistently described as being much larger than human feet, showing toe impressions and appearing at elevations, and in conditions where human presence would be unusual. The tracks often appeared in remote areas rarely visited by locals, adding to the mystery of what could have made them. The most famous Yeti photograph was taken in 1951 by mountaineer Eric Shipton during a reconnaissance expedition on Everest. The photograph shows a clear footprint in the snow, approximately 13 inches long and 8 inches wide, with what appears to be 5 toes and a distinctive large toe set to the side like a thumb. The print was photographed next to an ice axe for scale, providing clear size reference. This image became the most reproduced piece of Yeti evidence and sparked renewed Western interest in the creature. Shipton's photograph was analyzed extensively. Some experts suggested it showed a human footprint that had melted and distorted in the sun, causing it to appear larger and more unusual than when first made. Others argued that no amount of melting could explain the specific shape and features visible in the photograph. The debate over this single image continues to this day, with believers and skeptics interpreting it according to their pre-existing positions. The 1950s brought expeditions specifically seeking the Yeti. In 1954, the Daily Mail sponsored an expedition led by Ralph Izard to search for the creature. They found tracks and heard local accounts, but obtained no definitive evidence. In 1960, Sir Edmund Hillary, who had conquered Everest in 1953, led an expedition that included Yeti hunting among its goals. Hillary's expedition collected what was claimed to be a Yeti scalp from Kumjung Monastery, brought it back for analysis, and discovered it was actually made from the skin of a serow, a Himalayan goat antelope. This revelation damaged, but didn't destroy, Yeti credibility. Believers argued that the monks might have created the fake scalp to protect the real one, or that it had been substituted at some point. Skeptics took it as evidence that all Yeti artifacts would prove similarly mundane upon scientific examination. Hillary himself became skeptical about the Yeti's existence, suggesting that sightings were likely misidentifications of known animals, particularly bears. Reinhold Messner, one of the world's most accomplished mountaineers, had his own Yeti encounter in 1986 while trekking alone in Tibet. He reported seeing a large, upright figure moving through the forest at twilight. Rather than running away, Messner spent years investigating, interviewing witnesses, and studying Himalayan wildlife. He concluded that the Yeti was most likely the Tibetan blue bear, a rare subspecies of brown bear that can walk upright and matches many Yeti descriptions. Messner wrote a book about his investigations, presenting the Tibetan blue bear theory as the most plausible explanation. The Tibetan blue bear theory has gained acceptance among many researchers. These bears are critically endangered and rarely seen, inhabiting remote mountain regions. They can stand upright to survey their surroundings or to intimidate threats. When seen from a distance in poor visibility, particularly in silhouette or dim light, an upright bear could easily be mistaken for a bipedal hominid. The bear's tracks can appear unusual in snow, particularly when melted or distorted. Himalayan brown bears and Asian black bears also inhabit the region and could account for some sightings. Asian black bears have a distinctive white V-shaped marking on their chests, which might explain some reports of Yetis with unusual markings. Both species can walk upright for short distances and are capable of surviving in harsh mountain conditions. Their tracks in snow, especially when partially melted or filled with wind-blown snow, can appear larger and stranger than fresh tracks would suggest. The atmospheric conditions in high mountains can create optical illusions that might contribute to Yeti sightings. Altitude affects perception and judgment, potentially causing climbers to misinterpret what they're seeing. The thin air, extreme cold, and intense sunlight can all affect vision and cognition. Frostbite, altitude sickness, and exhaustion can cause hallucinations or misperceptions. These factors don't explain all Yeti reports, particularly those from experienced Sherpa living at high altitudes their entire lives. But they might account for some sightings by visitors not adapted to mountain conditions. In recent years, genetic analysis has been applied to supposed Yeti samples. In 2014, researchers analyzed hair samples claimed to come from Yetis, collected from various Himalayan locations. DNA testing revealed that the samples came from known animals, Himalayan bears, horses, and in one case, a prehistoric polar bear species. While this last result generated excitement about possible undiscovered bear species in the Himalayas, it didn't provide evidence for a bipedal primate. A 2017 study analyzed multiple purported Yeti samples, including bone, hair, and tissue from collections in museums and private hands. The genetic analysis identified all samples as coming from known animals, primarily bears, Himalayan brown bear, Asiatic black bear, and Tibetan blue bear, with one sample from a dog. The study concluded that the Yeti legend likely represents cultural memories and misidentifications of bears, rather than an unknown primate species. However, the Himalayas remain one of Earth's most challenging environments, with vast areas that are rarely visited by humans. New species of mammals are occasionally discovered in Southeast Asia and the Himalayan region, though typically these are small animals like rodents or small primates rather than large creatures. The possibility of an unknown large primate existing undetected seems remote, but not absolutely impossible. Some cryptids dwell in forests or lakes, places where life is abundant and creatures might reasonably hide. The Mongolian death worm, by contrast, supposedly inhabits one of Earth's harshest environments. The Gobi Desert, a vast expanse of extreme temperatures, scarce water, and seemingly lifeless sand. Yet according to Mongolian nomads who have lived in and around the desert for generations, something lurks beneath those sands, something deadly and strange that emerges during the hottest months to hunt, kill, and terrify anyone unfortunate enough to encounter it. The creature is known locally as Algokorkoi, which translates approximately to intestine worm or large intestine worm, referring to its supposed appearance. A thick, tubular body resembling a section of intestine, typically described as dark red or brownish in color. The death worm is said to measure between 2 and 5 feet in length, about as thick as a man's arm, with no visible head, eyes, or other distinguishing features beyond what might be a mouth at one end. It moves by rolling or undulating beneath and across the sand, leaving disturbed tracks that supposedly betray its passage. What makes the Mongolian death worm particularly fearsome in local legend isn't just its appearance, but its alleged abilities. The creature supposedly can kill at a distance, either by spitting a corrosive venom that causes immediate, agonizing death, or by emitting electrical discharges that can kill both humans and animals. According to traditional accounts, the worm can kill a camel, corrode metal, and turn vegetation yellow merely by touching it. These dramatic claims have made the death worm one of cryptozoology's most exotic and, frankly, implausible creatures. The creature allegedly appears above ground only during the hottest months, typically June and July, when the desert reaches its most extreme temperatures. Local belief holds that the worm is particularly active after rainfall, which is rare in the Gobi but does occasionally occur. During most of the year, the death worm supposedly remains deep underground, perhaps hibernating or simply avoiding the harsh surface conditions. This seasonal appearance might explain why the creature is reportedly so rarely seen, even by people who live in the region. Mongolian nomads treat the death worm with considerable respect and fear. Many refuse to speak about it directly or will only discuss it reluctantly. This reticence isn't simply superstition. It reflects genuine concern about a creature they believe is genuinely dangerous. Parents warn children about the death worm, and certain areas of the Gobi are supposedly avoided because of the creature's presence. These cultural attitudes suggest that the legend serves a protective function, teaching caution in a dangerous environment. Western awareness of the Mongolian death worm began with paleontologist Roy Chapman Andrews, who led expeditions to Mongolia in the 1920s, searching for dinosaur fossils. Andrews heard about the death worm from local guides and mentioned it in his 1926 book, On the Trail of Ancient Man. While Andrews himself was skeptical, dismissing it as folklore, his mention of the creature introduced it to Western readers and established it in cryptozoological literature. The Czech cryptozoologist Ivan Mackerel led several expeditions to Mongolia, specifically, to search for the death worm in the 1990s and 2000s. Despite extensive searching, interviewing locals, and spending considerable time in the Gobi, Mackerel never found concrete evidence of the creature's existence. He collected numerous second-hand accounts from people who claimed to know someone who'd seen the worm, but direct eyewitnesses proved elusive. Nevertheless, Mackerel remained convinced that some unusual creature existed in the desert, even if it didn't match the most dramatic aspects of the legend. British researchers conducted expeditions in 2003 and 2004, using various techniques to try to detect the death worm. They brought equipment to detect electrical fields, interviewed numerous locals, and explored remote areas of the Gobi. Like Mackerel, they found no direct evidence, but collected many stories. Interestingly, they noted that descriptions of the creature varied considerably among different informants, suggesting either that multiple different animals were being described, or that the legend had evolved and diversified over time. So what might the Mongolian death worm actually be if it's based on real animals? Several candidates have been proposed. The most commonly suggested explanation is that the death worm represents misidentified or exaggerated sightings of real animals that do inhabit the Gobi Desert and its periphery. The Tartar sand boa, a non-venomous snake found in Central Asia, including parts of Mongolia, is a leading candidate. This snake spends much of its life underground, emerging primarily at night or after rain. It's thick-bodied relative to its length, giving it an appearance somewhat similar to death worm descriptions. When threatened, the sand boa raises and waves its blunt tail, which resembles its head, potentially confusing predators. This defensive behavior might have contributed to descriptions of a creature with no distinguishing features. However, sand boas reach only about 2 feet in length, smaller than most death worm reports, and they possess no electrical or venom-spitting abilities. Various species of legless lizards, such as members of the genus Ophisaurus, inhabit regions around the Gobi. These lizards resemble snakes, but are actually lizards that have evolved to a limbless form. They burrow underground and could potentially match some aspects of death worm descriptions. Like the sand boa, they don't possess the dramatic abilities attributed to the death worm, and they're generally too small to match the larger size estimates. Some researchers have suggested that the death worm might be an unknown species of amphisbaenian, or worm lizard. These peculiar reptiles are adapted for underground life, with cylindrical bodies, reduced eyes, and specialized skulls for burrowing. Most are small, but if a larger species existed in the Gobi, it might better match death worm descriptions. However, no amphisbaenians have been documented in Mongolia, and discovering a completely unknown family member of this group would be surprising. The electrical discharge claim is particularly problematic from a biological perspective. While electric eels and some other aquatic animals can generate electrical fields, no terrestrial animals are known to produce electrical discharges powerful enough to kill at a distance. Evolution of such an ability would require specialized organs and systems that would be extraordinarily unusual in a desert reptile. This aspect of the legend is almost certainly folkloric embellishment rather than biological reality. The venom-spitting claim is somewhat more plausible, as some cobra species can spit venom at threats' eyes. However, the distances reported in death worm legends, several feet or more, and the supposed lethality of mere contact with the venom seem exaggerated beyond what any known animal could achieve. If the death worm is based on a real animal, this ability is likely either entirely fictitious or dramatically exaggerated from more modest defensive capabilities. Cultural factors certainly play a role in death worm legends. The Gobi Desert is a harsh, dangerous environment where people do die from heat, dehydration, and exposure. Creating a creature that embodies the desert's dangers provides a focus for legitimate fears about the environment. The death worm becomes a personification of desert danger, a way of teaching respect for the landscape and caution when traveling through it. The creature also serves social functions. Stories about the death worm create shared cultural knowledge among Mongolian communities. Elders can teach younger generations through these tales, passing down both the legend itself and the environmental wisdom embedded in it. The stories create identity and continuity, connecting modern Mongolians to ancestral knowledge and tradition. From a skeptical perspective, the Mongolian death worm likely represents a combination of misidentified real animals, probably sand boas or similar reptiles. Folkloric embellishment transforming modest creatures into deadly monsters, cultural tradition maintaining and elaborating the legend, and the psychological tendency to attribute mysterious deaths or misfortunes to a tangible cause. The harsh desert environment where deaths do occur, and where people sometimes encounter unusual wildlife, provides fertile ground for such legends to develop and persist. The complete lack of physical evidence despite searches by multiple expeditions suggests that if the death worm exists, it's either extraordinarily rare, remarkably good at avoiding detection, or doesn't exist as described in the most dramatic versions of the legend. The absence of photographs, specimens, tracks, or any physical trace in an era of ubiquitous cameras and scientific equipment makes the creature's existence increasingly implausible. Yet the legend persists, maintained by people who know the Gobi intimately and who insist that something unusual exists in those sands. Whether that something is a real animal species that science hasn't properly identified, a case of persistent misidentification, or purely folkloric, doesn't diminish the legend's cultural importance or its role in cryptozoology's catalog of mysterious creatures. The Mongolian death worm reminds us that Earth still has harsh, remote places where legends can flourish, where the gap between human knowledge and the vast unknowns of wilderness still leaves room for mystery and wonder. The final creature in our journey takes us to the swamps, billabongs, and waterways of Australia, a continent famous for its unique and often dangerous wildlife. Among the many creatures that inhabit this ancient land, both real and legendary, few have captured Australian imagination quite like the bunyip, a mysterious water-dwelling creature that appears throughout indigenous Australian traditions and later European settler accounts. Unlike cryptids that might be misidentified known animals, the bunyip's descriptions are so varied and contradictory that determining what, if anything, it might represent presents unique challenges. The word bunyip comes from the Wemba language of southeastern Australia. Though indigenous Australian peoples across the continent had various names for water-dwelling creatures in their traditions, the bunyip appears in Dreamtime stories, the sacred narratives that explain the world's creation and the relationships among people, animals, land, and spirit beings. In many of these traditions, the bunyip represents danger associated with water holes, billabongs, and rivers, teaching caution around water and respect for these important but potentially dangerous places. The challenge with understanding the bunyip through indigenous traditions is that different Aboriginal nations had very different conceptions of water creatures, and European colonizers often conflated these diverse traditions into a single bunyip legend. Some groups described large water-dwelling predators. Others spoke of spiritual beings associated with water rather than physical animals. Some traditions included creatures that punished those who violated taboos or disrespected water sources. Collapsing this rich diversity into a single cryptid category does a disservice to the complexity of indigenous Australian cultures. European settlers began reporting bunyip encounters in the early 19th century. These reports described creatures that varied wildly in appearance. Some accounts portrayed the bunyip as dog-faced with a crocodile-like head. Others described it as having a round head like a bulldog, dark fur, and 4 legs. Still others reported something more like a large seal. Some descriptions included flippers or fins, while others mentioned clawed feet. The creature was said to measure anywhere from 4 to 15 feet in length. This extraordinary variation in descriptions suggests that bunyip became a catch-all term for any unexplained water creature or unusual animal encounter. One of the most detailed early accounts came from 1847, when a strange skull was discovered in the Murrumbidgee River near Balranald in New South Wales. The skull was displayed in Sydney and generated considerable excitement, with newspapers reporting it as possible bunyip remains. Indigenous Australians who saw it apparently confirmed it looked like a bunyip. However, the skull was later identified as belonging to a deformed horse or cow, and it subsequently disappeared, preventing further analysis. In 1851, a dramatic account appeared in the Melbourne Argus, describing how a man named Blake and his companions encountered a bunyip in the Murray River. According to the report, the creature had an elongated neck about 3 feet long, a head resembling a kangaroo with large, visible teeth, dark black fur, and large flippers or fins. It allegedly made roaring sounds and appeared extremely dangerous. The men reportedly shot at it, but the creature disappeared into the water. This account, like many bunyip reports, remains impossible to verify and might represent misidentification, fabrication, or genuine encounter with something unusual. Aboriginal artist Chalacum in the mid-19th century provided drawings of bunyips based on traditional knowledge. His depictions showed creatures with features resembling seals or sea lions, with flippers, fur, and aquatic adaptations. These drawings suggest that at least some indigenous Australian conceptions of bunyips might have been based on observations of real aquatic mammals, possibly ones that have since become extinct, or that were unusual visitors to inland waterways. The paleontological hypothesis for the bunyip focuses on extinct Australian megafauna. Until about 40,000 years ago, Australia was home to various large animals that have since gone extinct. Diprotodon, a massive wombat-like marsupial that could weigh up to 2,800 pounds, lived throughout Australia and was semi-aquatic, inhabiting areas near water. Palourchests, another large marsupial, had an elongated face that might resemble some Bunyip descriptions. Procoptodon, a giant kangaroo, stood over 6 feet tall. Could indigenous Australian traditions preserve cultural memories of these extinct animals, passed down through tens of thousands of years of oral tradition? This theory is intriguing, but faces significant challenges. 40,000 years is an extraordinarily long time for specific details to be preserved in oral tradition. Most researchers consider it more likely that if megafauna influenced the legends at all, they did so by leaving bones that were later discovered and interpreted as belonging to mysterious creatures, rather than through direct cultural memory of living animals. Another theory proposes that Bunyip legends might be based on seals or sea lions that occasionally traveled up rivers into inland waterways. Australian fur seals and other pinniped species do occasionally appear in unusual locations, and their appearance would certainly be startling to people living far from the coast. Seals on land can move in ways that appear strange and potentially threatening, and they can make extraordinary vocalizations. A seal encountered unexpectedly in an inland billabong might generate reports of an unknown creature. Large fish provide another possible explanation. Murray cod, native to Australia's river systems, can grow to enormous sizes, occasionally exceeding 180 pounds and 6 feet in length. Seeing a fish of this size could certainly inspire stories of monsters, particularly among people unfamiliar with the species' maximum size. Other large freshwater fish, or even sharks that occasionally travel up rivers, might also contribute to creature reports. The saltwater crocodile, which inhabits northern Australia's waterways, might explain some Bunyip reports from northern regions. These enormous reptiles can grow over 20 feet long and weigh more than 2,000 pounds. They're genuinely dangerous, regularly killing people who venture too close to water in crocodile territory. However, crocodiles don't extend to southern Australia, where many Bunyip reports originated, limiting this explanation's applicability. The psychological and cultural functions of the Bunyip legend are perhaps more important than any physical animal it might represent. For indigenous Australians, stories about dangerous water creatures taught essential survival lessons. Australia's waterways do present real dangers: drowning, crocodiles in the north, dangerous currents, and waterborne diseases. Creating a creature that embodies these dangers helps communicate important information, particularly to children who might not understand abstract warnings but can grasp stories about specific creatures. For European settlers, the Bunyip represented the strangeness and danger of the Australian landscape. The continent's unique wildlife challenged European understanding of the natural world. If Australia had animals as bizarre as platypuses and kangaroos, why couldn't it also harbor unknown creatures in its remote waterways? The Bunyip became a symbol of Australia's mysterious interior, the vast unknown spaces that Europeans were only beginning to explore and understand. The Bunyip entered Australian popular culture, appearing in children's books, poems, songs, and stories. The creature became less threatening over time, sometimes portrayed as friendly or comic rather than dangerous. This transformation reflects Australia's increasing settlement and development, as wilderness became less threatening and could be reimagined through more whimsical lenses. Today, most researchers consider the Bunyip a cultural phenomenon rather than a biological reality. The wildly varying descriptions suggest multiple sources for the legend: misidentified seals, large fish, cultural traditions about water safety, and the human tendency to create monsters that embody environmental dangers. The absence of any physical evidence despite Australia's extensive biological surveys and the presence of numerous naturalists and scientists for over 2 centuries makes the existence of a large unknown aquatic creature increasingly unlikely. Tonight, we've traveled across continents and through centuries, meeting creatures that live in that fascinating space between myth and reality, between the known and the unknown. What these 10 cryptids share isn't necessarily physical existence, but rather their power to capture human imagination and their ability to teach us something important about ourselves. They reveal how we process uncertainty, how we create meaning from ambiguous experiences, and how we use stories about mysterious creatures to encode genuine wisdom about our environments. They show us that even in our modern, mapped, satellite-surveyed world, there remain spaces for mystery, places where the line between the known and unknown stays pleasantly blurred. Thank you for joining me on this journey through 10 of the world's famous cryptids. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through one of our previous episodes will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may you find wonder in the mysterious, comfort in the unknown, and peace in knowing that the world, despite all our maps and measurements, still holds spaces for surprise and secrets yet to be discovered.